Thank you, Lawrence. Hi, everybody. So it's a great pleasure to be here because I was fighting for 2 days to be in Montreal and finally made it 30 minutes ago, or a bit more. So today I will have the pleasure to think about complementary things that what Maxwell discussed. It won't be too much in theory, but more about pragmatic take on how computational tools can be used for psychiatry especially. And where we are kind of echoing each other there is that I don't see any contradiction between the use of computational tools and information theory and having an ecological and ecosocial perspective on the human mind, especially in the case of neuropsychiatry. So, So my talk is the byproduct of many collaboration across the Atlantic, and especially also with my new team at the Sainte-Justine, and in partnership because I'm also affiliated to the MILA, the Quebec AI Institute. And so our team is called the Precision Psychiatry and Social Physiology Lab, is focused on three main big topics: computational psychiatry, so the use of mathematics and computer science for mental health; precision medicine, which is trying to tailor personalized care based on data from genome to smartphone; and social neuro AI, which is more theoretical and combines social neuroscience and artificial intelligence. But today I will focus on the computational psychiatry and how we can develop a computational psychiatry that's not necessarily computationalist, but still can use tools from computational theories. So in this paper with colleagues, we try to have a broader definition of what computational psychiatry is, and we delineate three main poles. One, which is traditionally what computational psychiatrists take as their field, which is generative modeling. A lot of it is based on decision making and Bayesian theory and reinforcement learning typically. But there is also another community thinking about being part of computational psychiatry as well, which is people using AI on big data to extract patterns from large amounts of data. And voluntarily, with my colleagues, we added also the digital psychiatry community, which make the contact of those two first community with the real world. Because in a way, that has been a big criticism about computational psychiatry by its lack of connection with the real stakeholders, the clinicians, the patient, etc., and not delivering necessarily in the end. And so through this digital psychiatry domain, there is an interface, bi-directional interface, where data are collected. So these digital tools can be smartphones, that can be databases from healthcare systems, that can be many things. And on the other side, the patterns and hypotheses that can be extracted from the generative modeling and machine learning can be operationalized through digital tools as intervention, political guidance for decision making in healthcare system, etc. And the big problem, as I say, is that computational psychiatry has been a bit searching what I like this image, searching their lost keys where they were like. So like they wanted to use mathematical tools, and so they took the topics and behavior where the mathematical tools were already well developed, and it falls in those two boxes, which is behavioral of positive valence and cognitive systems, mostly decision making and reinforcement learning. And there is a wall, terra incognita, so I use the old there be dragon terminology, because there is not so much paper out there consisting of the mechanisms at the biological level, the real embodiment per se in the systems biology perspective of social systems, arousal and reality system, and sensory motor systems. And so a big challenge is to cover this whole map. And on the other side, computational psychiatry has big dreams in the form of precision psychiatry. And the dream is to redefine what has been socially constructed by a consensus of experts through more data-driven approach, typically taking a wide heterogeneity of individuals to manage to design subgroups, homogeneous subgroups, where intervention can be better operationalized. And that can be done with clinical profile based on questionnaires, evaluation, and so on. But that can be also done with more omics type of data, for instance, in genetics, and there is a lot of inspiration from oncology, for instance, in that case, which leads a bit the precision medicine approach to design from genetic data those clusters of homogeneous genetic profile. And the end goal is to have not only an understanding of the underlying etiology and genetic underlying the risk of psychiatric conditions, but also potentially to find what are the best intervention for all those subgroups of patients. But the problem is that both computational psychiatry and precision psychiatry tend to adopt a very reductionist perspective on human health and mental health, especially quite at contrary of what systems biology and physiology even, like Claude Bernard is like 2 centuries away and already was saying we have to be careful because systems are in our mind is not in nature, and nature doesn't care about those scales of observations. And even those scales are interacting between each other, so we need to have a better approach to deal with that. And there are computational tools to do that, so it's not like incompatible at all. There's on top like different theories, so Maxwell well described the different waves and churches and different people thinking they have understood the elephant in the middle. I think we are all the blind around the elephant, and I'm all for theoretical plurality here because we are far from the end of history. I come back from New York where the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness showed that after 25 years there's no consensus between the leading theories, so there's clearly a lot of things to do yet. And there's also different disciplines, typically when we are dealing with cognitive science, but even more when we are dealing with mental health, that needs to be also combined with different techniques, methods, terminology, and so on. And in that sense, the biggest challenge in the case of medicine and mental health is that we have different actors with different motives, with different interests, needs, etc. And we're going to see at the end also how those actors sometimes have a misunderstanding and a misattunement of their interest and topics of work. So that becomes trickier even when actually mental disorders and mental conditions are integrating the social domain. So like typically in the case of autism or schizophrenia, those conditions have a strong social component, and despite having a big molecular now understanding, we have no clue how to make the connection between those hundreds of genes that have been now associated with the condition of autism and the wide heterogeneity at the phenotypic level and at the clinical level. And in the case of psychiatry, that's like the Cambridge model by Berlioz, the very origin of symptoms also is a result of a social dialogue between the patient, the individuals, and its environment, whether it's like its family, its co-worker, and even the healthcare system and the clinicians. So those social aspects are also key in general for psychiatry. So the pragmatic take here, and I borrowed that from David Riddich and Joshua Gordon, who wrote one of the first books entitled Computational Psychiatry at the Ernst Riemann Forum, is that the strength of computational modeling is that it kind of creates a lingua franca for discussing between scales, between disciplines, and by making connections between those scales and disciplines that were not talking to each other, it can lead to insights for psychiatry. So it's not only about brute forcing with computational methods, decision making in clinical context. It's also potentially about leading to insights to have a better understanding of what's going on, and maybe also make strong case about aspects and dimensions of mental health that have been ignored with the reductionist thinking until now. So it's not like that. It's not that as easy that just you have computational methods and boom, you have computational psychiatry. There are many people, of course, writing about it. I mentioned there are like the two main culture, like more data-driven or hypothesis-driven. And as I say, like in this framework, they tend to put aside the digital tools and the interface with the patient, which is very strange. So it tends to be very remote and in a research setting rather than a translational setting. But I think there is a lot of things to deliver. So typically, for instance, in the case of semiology, we see in the case of autism, for instance, that what is taken usually as a ground truth is just a historical consensus. We are like at the early stage, prototypical taxonomy that have been proposed, and Lorna Wing, for instance, made a connection between those prototypes, and with the DSM, after one version and another version, we ended up with more like a spectrum perspective on autism. But now that we have a lot of data, we can also challenge those different perspectives that have been set across history, and we have quantitative method to test if all the people that we consider as diagnosed with autism, for instance, are completely heterogeneous. Is there like a parsimonious way of describing them in matter of subgroups, or if indeed there is only one clinical prototype? And in staggering contrast with what I'm just describing, the large majority of all medical, biomedical research holds on just control versus patients, group mean differences. And so that's where I think the opportunity is for computational psychiatry to shine by proposing approach that kind of move away from this very statistically p-value under 0.05 and boom, champagne we publish, that goes with a marginalization and a kind of focus on some things that are not clinically significant. So with this paper with IVADO, we've conducted a meta-analysis, for instance, in the case of the biomedical research on autism, and we show that the effect size in the literature do not exceed about 1, which is like by psychology standard and neuroscience standard are considered as huge. But when you go back to what does it mean from a clinical standpoint, an effect size of 1 is about 16% of patients being above 2 standard deviation of the control. So, well, we have to be careful when we claim statistical significance as being clinically significant, and how it can create also false prior in clinicians reading headlines in big journals. So yeah, the challenge is to go beyond this case versus control, and there are like 2 main approach where we have good computational methods to deal with. The first one is normative modeling, which is a family of methods to deal with developmental trajectories and consisting of describing more psychopathology as a continuous space. And the other one is stratification that I illustrate early on with finding subgroups. And those are like classical methods in machine learning and computational science, which called basically clustering techniques. And to go back to the social level, so my work originally is mostly focused on multi-brain neuroscience. I've discovered like more than 10 years ago how social interaction leads to the synchronization of brains and thus pushing towards a neuroscience that integrates sociality more seriously. And from what I just described, that, well, in conditions like autism, the social interaction is key. And on top, for instance, in the case of Berrios' model, any psychiatric condition involves a part of social interaction with the world. We need to explain what's going on in social interaction to be able also to have a better understanding of what's going on in those conditions. And so in this field, it's not the topic of the talk today, we made a statement that computational tools like human-machine interaction and computational simulations can be very relevant to have a quantitative and computational approach of things that are not necessarily brain-bounded reductionist in the classical sense. And you can even use those computational tools to make a strong case that those things are important. So one example was following the discovery of this inter-brain synchronization during social interaction that still continue to be a big controversy. One question was what was the contribution of the anatomical structure to this propensity to get in sync at finer grain in time with other people. And we showed that indeed anatomical structure was part of the factor that contributed to this propensity. And on top, that it was not a question necessarily of just a specific brain region, it was a distributed property. And in that sense, it was strongly resonating, pun intended, with theories about how we can see certain conditions like autism not as a problem with a specific gene or a specific brain region, but more as a diversity condition. So there is a whole literature now about neurodiversity, and here with those simulations, we tend to show how by being outside the norm topologically, it leads to an altered ability to synchronize with the norm, like the neurotypical population. And there are like colleagues like Dimitris Bolis and Leonard Schilbar who push further this argument by saying that by misattunement originally with this very low level sensorimotor loop at the biological level, this percolate then through development at the cognitive behavioral level and even sociocultural level. And another interesting take from those simulations is that it's not necessarily the one-side problem. Like if we have something that is distributed and that the similarity of topology between the brains play a role in the ability to synchronize and to get coordinate with others, then it's a dyadic problem. So that those conditions are not, and that's why I mentioned the statistical significance is not clinically significant also, because some of those results tend to characterize, oh, autism is a default of attention, or so autism is the default of social learning, or et cetera, et cetera. But there is also a literature, and the simulation goes in that way as well, that neurotypical participants have as much problems to guess emotion of autistic individuals than autistic individuals have problems to guess emotion of neurotypical individuals. So it's like a misattunement, but the misattunement is not on the fault of one side or the other, it's a bidirectional thing. It was ironic because I presented it on Zoom, but today I'm in physically, so that's good. We also show that by simulating those models and doing also empirical results, those interbrain synchronization could have consequences on the ability to coordinate and have interaction with others through technology-mediated tools. And that has consequences at the more digital psychiatry level for telemedicine and how we deal with, for instance, after the pandemic, having a lot of people taking their psychotherapy through Zoom or video conferencing. And again, those computational models can help to understand what's going on and what are the underlying factors between the latency that are created by those technology of video conferencing and the underlying mechanisms of social cognition in the human brain. So that can be connected, for instance, to other literature in multibrain neuroscience, such as the Therapeutic Alliance theory. So to make an echo also to the talk of Maxwell, I'm totally for making bridges between dynamical system theory and information theory. There's no contradiction between the two, and to me that's true formalism in a way. Recently with my colleague at Mila, we tried to combine those two frameworks to, for instance, explain the apparent loss of information when we are trying to express our experience, and how this loss of information happens even inside our brain before even we communicate to others. So how when we have the experience first at the first level, and when we try to introspect about the experience, there's already a kind of loss of information. So those mathematical tools can also help to understand and decipher what are the different factors contributing of this information loss. And more recently, we have also started to work on the connection between one theory called the attention schema theory of Michael Gardiano in Princeton that connects social cognition with individual cognition. And so we are making simulations using multi-agent reinforcement learning to see how little agents in a virtual world can learn from other agents and take that for their individual cognition. So in this case, we are more taking computational methods as a bootstrap, a sandbox to test theories of cognition. And we are not yet having psychotherapy for virtual agents, but that would be the next step, to have a kind of virtual petri dish for testing potential mechanism of psychopathology, not only inside the agent, but also in a social setting. So for instance, this paper from Stanford recently attracted a lot of attention. I really like the concept called interactive simulacra of human behavior. And they create like a virtual world. Some people compare that to the Westworld series, where a lot of these agents have discussion between each other and having action and so on. And they show that there are emergent properties that occur in this little society. And so we can take that as potential crash test for intervention, either at the individual level or at more collective level. And finally, all those computational tools, we have to be careful also about all the load at the ideological and epistemological level, because they are mostly from Western weird country, but also a lot from California, you know. And so we can have other narrative than the classical narrative around artificial intelligence, machine learning, and those computational tools. And recently we have this wonderful project carried by Jason Edward Lewis at Concordia and Yu Wanga called Abundant Intelligence. It's a large 5-year project by the New Frontier Research Fund, where we're going to try to seek new narrative about artificial intelligence and computational tools based on indigenous knowledge systems. And so that I'm very enthusiastic about this project because I think there's a lack of diversity in the narrative around AI, and that would be very fruitful even outside the pure neuropsychiatric case. Then, speaking about more collective approach of computational tools, we can also use those methods and so on. So the simulacra of Stanford is a bit of an illustration of that it can go beyond the individuals. But here is another one that speaks directly to psychiatry and mental health. In this paper, we use natural language processing computational methods to analyze discourse and narrative between Twitter and autism families, communities in a more popular discourse, and the narrative about autism in PubMed to check what are the topics that researchers work on. And, and what we found, long story short, is typically a misalignment. So what I was talking about with the multitude of actors in medicine and how it's complicated. Typically, in the case of this paper, we show that the topics that are funded and that biomedical research study are totally non-overlapping with the interest and needs of the community. So there is something to do, I guess, in those kind of situations. Always also still on autism, but a different take beyond the individual. Here it's more epidemiology at the population level, so it's like it's descriptive statistics. We had access to the whole population of UK for this paper. And we looked at the social determinants of health based on socio-demographic and neighborhoods statistics, so it's geographic-based statistics. And we show that those social determinants can have one order of magnitude stronger effect on the chance of being diagnosed on autism than classical genetics and neuroscience. It doesn't mean that it's causal, but it shows that the access and the ability of people to get diagnostics are heavily constrained by socio-demographic aspects. And so from a decision-making for policymaker, making all the funding going, and I'm shooting in my own feet here because I'm doing a lot of genetics and neuroscience, but investing in humanities and also socioeconomic approach to deal with that may also give large effects on those communities. Finally, if we allow ourselves to project a bit in the future, there are also tools that can have potential use at the interface between computational and digital. A lot of people were talking about the metaverse. The thing is now dying a bit, but the technology is there. We have developed one of the first video game using extended reality for neuropsychological assessment through video game. I think that there is a lot of things to explore in those aspects. Typically, kids waiting at the hospital, instead of waiting and be bored, could play games and have an assessment before even seeing their doctor. And there's also a big recent problem that happened is that chatbots and all those large language models like ChatGPT and so on tend to be better in some case to express things to patients. So like this as it recently in JAMA, it has to be taken with a lot of to be careful because it's only about text. So in this study, for instance, they use Reddit, so it's like a kind of online forum, public forum, and they answer questions of people either through clinicians, real clinicians, or with those GPT-like chatbots, and they show that the way people judge those responses were better in the case of chatbots. So that asks a lot of questions. So what are we going to do with that? People tend to be ignoring and in denial about that. For instance, if we consider that psychotherapy costs a lot of money and there are a lot of people waiting months and months to get access to a clinician, paying $20 and have immediately access to a chatbot that could potentially answer some of your questions, some people are already doing that. I mean, I know, I've seen posting that, they know the prompt to use to have a kind of coaching or counseling to chatbots. So are we going to regulate that? Are we going to help people to use that in a convenient way and not have problems? That's there, and that involves all the disciplines, I think, from machine learning people to more ethicists. And so as a conclusion, well, I made a strong case that computational tools can help us to bridge different scales, and especially help for the social aspect that has been put a bit aside, sadly. And thank you for your attention.